Welcome to my kind of first informational video. I made some other videos, but I took them down, so if you're confused on why they're not there, if you had seen them, there were just some difficulties, and they had, so I stopped making them, and then I just took the others down. But we're going to go through the evidence for the resurrection, but before we do that, we have to go through, did Jesus die? Because you can't be raised from the dead if you just don't die. So, that's what we're going to go through first. Did Jesus die by crucifixion? Crucifixion specifically. So today's question will be, did Jesus die by crucifixion specifically? Now, I want to throw in that in this entire series, I will not rely much, though I will a little bit since they are historical documents, on the Gospels or disputed letters of Paul. So keep that in mind. Also, look on the top right for sources and citation of quotes, though they will also sometimes be right above the quote or my claim as well. So the first thing I want to explain is that most scholars actually accept this. Now, scholars can be wrong, so this isn't like a end-all here, but it does mean that there's probably good reason to accept it, and it also helps keep us on track and prevents any unnecessary debates if we just stay with what most scholars already accept. So I'm going to give us a brief roadmap of what this video is going to be about. We're going to start with the earliest sources, which is either Paul or a hymn in Philippians. I'll also add the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. There's also secular sources, such as Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, not sure which, and the Talmud. Then there's the Gospels, all written within 65-ish years of Jesus. And then lastly, there's medical science. So, to start, the earliest source is either a hymn in Philippians 2, 6 through 11, or Paul himself in Galatians. The reason I say either is because the date of the hymn is unknown. Maybe it's before Galatians, maybe not. Now, Galatians was written between 48 AD and 56 AD, and the date of Philippians is kind of debated, but usually dated around 62 AD. However, the hymn in Philippians is believed by many scholars to be before then. So I won't go too in depth of why they think this is a hymn, but I will do a brief overview. 1. Scholars do generally accept this. 2. There are words that Paul never uses called non-Pauline words. And lastly, there's a lot of words that he almost never uses. So the hymn in Philippians is relatively long, so I will only say the necessary part, which is verse 8. He, that is Jesus, humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. The first part of Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ. With Christ implies that Christ too was crucified. Since Galatians can be dated as late as 56 AD, I will also add 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the first being about 53 AD and the second being about 55 AD. 1 Corinthians 1:23 says, But we preach about a crucified Christ, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. 2 Corinthians 13:4 says, For indeed he, that is Jesus, was crucified by reason of weakness. Lastly, I want to add the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which most date between 3 to 5 years of the death of Jesus. It says in verse 3 that Jesus died. It does not say it by crucifixion, but it at least says that he died. And since this is considered the earliest source about Jesus, it is definitely important. Therefore, we have two early sources, one dating 20 to 25 years, which is Paul, and one dating sometime between a year to 30 years, which would be the Philippians hymn, plus 1 Corinthians 15 creed that dates within a few months to at most 5 years, though some go as far to say 8. Next thing we're going to go through is the secular sources, starting with the most well-known, which is Josephus. Josephus was born about 37 AD, and he mentions Jesus twice, both of which are found in the Antiquities of the Jews, written about 93 AD. One of them is called the Testimonium Flavianum, which is probably the most famous one, and the other one is considered pretty much authentic by everybody. However, the Testimonium is said to, or most scholars believe that the Testimonium has some Christian changes and additions to it. I'll do another video on this probably eventually, but right now we're just going to go with what most scholars says, which is that it is somewhat authentic, but there's been changes. Here's what the earliest version, which is in Greek, says. It says that, Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. he drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Most scholars agree that if you just take some things out and rephrase, that you get closer to the original. And on top of that, some believe that the Arabic version may be closer to the original. Here's what the Arabic version says. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. And his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So, since it takes out more of the Christian-y words and replaces, you can see why some can take it as more original. Now, many have tried to reconstruct what Josephus said originally. What's important here is that almost all of them include that Josephus said that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Therefore, this can be added. The next one is Tacitus. He was born about 56 AD, and he wrote his Annals about early in the 2nd century sometime. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, which is the Latin form of Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, but the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful come from every part of the world and find their center and become popular. Wow, so he seems very friendly to Christianity. Many scholars, including skeptics, seem to agree that the extreme penalty is referring to crucifixion. Now this makes sense because crucifixion was the worst way to die, and arguably is just the worst way to die. Crucifixion process, which we'll get into. Probably the worst way to die, and it was the highest form of punishment in Rome. Next is the Talmud. The part that mentioned Jesus was compiled between 70 AD and 200 AD, called the Tanaitic period. And it says that on the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. Yeshu is, in Greek, is Jesus, and hanged was a common form of, or was just another term for crucifixion at that time. The last sector their source will be mentioning is Lucian or Lucian. I can't fully remember how it's pronounced. He was born about 120 AD, and he finished the death of Peregrine about 165 AD, so it is a little bit late. He says, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Now, he may seem friendly, but he actually was not. This was more of a sarcastic, him mocking, basically, is what this was. Anyway, he will be added. Therefore, for non-Christian sources, we have Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and the Talmud, all of which had a negative outlook on Christianity, adding credibility due to enemy attestation. Next, we're going to go through the Gospels. Mark is believed to have been written first, and Matthew and Luke are believed to have used Mark. However, independent stuff in them are called M and L. So Mark 15, we find a very in-depth story, I guess, the in-depth report of the death of Jesus by crucifixion. And then we also have in Luke 23, 39 to 43, some independent material about the death of Jesus, and then there's John. Now, I didn't find anything that in Matthew about his crucifixion that's not in Mark. There could be some in there that's independent, but I can't verify it, so I'm not going to add it. We'll just stick with Mark, Luke, and John. Therefore, we have Mark said to be written within 32 to 37 years of Jesus, Luke said to be written 50-ish years later, and John said to be written about 60-ish years later. and they give the most in-depth material that we have. The last thing we will go through is medical science. Since historically we can be sure that he was crucified and that he was killed, but specifically we know historically how crucifixion worked and that Jesus was crucified, we can now look at the science to show that he was in fact died from crucifixion. There was only one person that is said to have survived crucifixion, and it was from Josephus. There was 3 of Josephus's friends that were being crucified by Titus, and well, Josephus asked Titus, who was also his friend, "Can you please take them down?" And so they did, and they gave him, they took him down before they died, and gave him the best medical help Rome could offer. Even though 3 were taken down, 2 of them died anyway because crucifixion was just so effective. Now, keep in mind that Jesus was judged to be dead and was not given medical help. Now, earlier I mentioned that crucifixion is a process. The process started with being flogged. Then you were forced to carry part of your cross to the crucifixion place, and then you were crucified. So we're going to start with flogging. But first I want to explain that there have been numerous studies on how people died in crucifixion, and none of them agree because there were so many ways to die in crucifixion because it was just so deadly. Now, let's go through flogging. This was the usual way that criminals were prepared for crucifixion. Frederick T. Zugby was a very educated and experienced medical examiner until 2013 when he unfortunately passed away. He studied this, and he explains that after a scourging, large black and blue and reddish-purple bruises, lacerations, scratches, welts, and swelling would appear all over the front and back of the victim's body, and primarily around the puncture marks. He goes on to explain that the ribs were frequently cracked during the process. Furthermore, he explains that the victim's breathing would be severely affected because of the severe blows to the chest would cause excruciating rib pain and splinting every time he attempted to take a breath. The intercostal muscles located between the ribs and the back and the chest muscles would be hemorrhagic, and the lungs lacerated, badly bruised, and frequently collapsed, all of which would have contributed to severe pain associated with breathing. In fact, some people died from flogging alone because it was just that bad. Next, we'll go through crucifixion. This is where your hands or wrists and feet were nailed. Now, it's generally agreed that it was his wrists that were nailed and not his hands, though the hands were certainly possible. Now, I know that translations say hands, but the Greek word there for hands can also mean wrists. Now, when his feet were pierced, it would pierce several bones and nerves, which would have caused severe pain. And then if it went through his wrist, which is a very strong possibility, it would have also pierced a nerve called the median nerve. It's also likely that it would have dislocated his shoulder as well. Now, once upon the cross, he would begin to have to push up and down to breathe, because in the down position, the muscles around your lungs would prohibit breathing until pushed into the up position. Furthermore, this would rub your scourged back against the wood every single time, scratching it, which on those extremely deep cuts, and that'd be very painful. So to put this together, flogging made this very difficult to breathe. Crucifixion made it all that much harder. And not to mention, every gospel except John explains that Jesus wasn't able to carry his cross, so evidently he was already exhausted, which is completely understandable. Now, flogging may have caused hypovolemic shock. In fact, in 2005, Zugby suggested that he died from hypovolemic shock. Hypovolemic shock would cause increased heartbeat, rapid but shallow breathing, and weakness. This is important because increased heartbeat would put stress on the heart, rapid but shallow breathing would make you require more breathing, while the weakness would make it harder to push up and down. He went through this for about 6 hours, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Now, some people actually lasted days. That blows my mind that people did that, how they even pulled that off. But the fact that he only lasted 6 hours, I think, is quite understandable, considering what he was going through. So, hypovolemic shock can be added as adding extra difficulty to breathing. Now, how could people tell if someone died or not? Well, it was actually quite easy. You just stopped going up and down. If you needed to go up and down to breathe, then, well, if you stop doing that, then you're not really breathing, and so you're dead. you won't be able to get enough oxygen to your brain. Furthermore, the Gospel of John says that he was stabbed with a spear and that blood and water came out. Now, the author probably would not have understood what was happening, which is why many consider it to be authentic. However, today we have more of an idea. So, Lee Strobel conducted an interview with Alexander Metherell, a man with a medical degree from the University of Miami and a researcher who has done extensive research into the death of Jesus. And Lee Strobel recorded his conversation in the Case for Christ. Metherell explains that the spear apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. So when the spear was pulled out, some fluid, the pericardial effusion and the pleural effusion, came out. He goes on to explain that this would have the appearance of a clear fluid like water, followed by a large volume of blood. And to add to this, centurions who were present at the crucifixion of Jesus were professionals in this area and were very experienced on killing people, which is not really something you want to be known for, but they were very good at it. Therefore, we can conclude historically that Jesus died by crucifixion by the earliest sources of Paul and the hymn in Philippians, secular sources of Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and the Talmud, and Mark, Luke, and John. That's 9 sources in all, plus the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which says that Jesus died. We can also conclude scientifically that Jesus certainly died. Due to flogging, hypovolemic shock, and the crucifixion, breathing would have been extremely difficult, especially for 6 hours. Then, since it's easy to tell if someone died, the experience and the training of the soldiers and the spear wound, we can be sure that Jesus was in fact dead when he was taken off that cross. Because of this, we officially conclude that we have reached the truth that Jesus died by crucifixion. Thank you all so much for watching. Please stay tuned, like, and subscribe, and I will be coming out with more things in the near future.